Our scripture for today is from Deuteronomy 34, verses 10 to 12. Never since has there arisen a prophet in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. He was unequal for all the signs and wonders that the Lord sent him to perform in the land of Egypt, against Pharaoh and all his servants and his entire land, and for all the mighty deeds and all the terrifying displays of power that Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. And from Romans 8, verse 28. We know that all things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. The word of the Lord for today. Thanks be to God.
All right, so we are continuing our sermon series on Moses. And so we are going to talk a little more. We're not getting very far. We're still in Exodus 2, and this is the third week. But that's okay, because I think we'll get a lot out of it. So, but let's talk a little bit more about Moses, because one of the things that I think is really neat about Moses is his importance to the Jewish people. He's an incredibly important prophet to the Jews. As a matter of fact, when we look at the prophecy that God gives the Jewish people, the Israelite people, back in Deuteronomy, he tells them that the coming Messiah will be a prophet like Moses. That's how important Moses was. That's how high up he is ranked. And Luke will make that connection. When he writes his two books, Luke and Acts, he will make that connection back to that prophecy in Deuteronomy for Jesus, that Jesus is the second Moses. So Moses is what I would say probably the most important of the Jewish prophets to even this day. He's incredibly important. And one of those reasons, of course, is that he liberated the people. He liberated, well, God did, but through Moses, liberated the Israelites. And when you think about that, took an incredible amount of work. I mean, he was the one that was willing to stand up to Pharaoh. I guarantee you there were a lot of people in Egypt at that time, a lot of Israelites in Egypt at that time, that were wishing that somebody would do something about the Egyptian problem. But it was Moses that actually stood up and did something about it. He was the one willing to risk his life and stand before Pharaoh and say, enough is enough. We can't keep doing this. You have to stop. He then had to keep all the people happy as the Egyptians fought back. Because the Egyptians didn't let them go lightly. Remember, they increased their workload, and it was already severe. So Moses is the one that's now having to try to keep everyone determined and convinced and happy that they can do this. And if you've ever been in a situation like that, and you've got people that are just complaining, it's not easy, is it, to lead a bunch of complainers into doing something altogether. Then he is the one that God performs miracles through him. I mean, they get backed up against a sea with an army coming at them, and Moses raises a staff and parts a sea. I mean, no prophet has done anything quite like that. I mean, it's an incredible miracle in front of them. But then he guides them through the wilderness and leads them and negotiates with all these people's lands that they're passing through, and then prepares them to get ready to go into the promised land. So an incredibly important person. But there's one incredibly important Israelite. But there's one thing we need to remember about Moses, that before he was an Israelite leader, he was an Egyptian. We kind of forget that part of Moses, that he was actually an Egyptian. And, I mean, born Hebrew, but lived and grew up in an Egyptian household. He had the finest of things. Remember, he grew up in the house of Pharaoh's daughter. I mean, he had the Porsche, the Ferrari, the Rolexes. He had it all. And he chose to leave that. But he had all that stuff. And he could have said, you know, it's a shame about the Hebrews. It's a shame. And I know my mom's people are there. But I really don't want to give up the Ferrari. I don't want to give up this house. I don't want to make these kinds of changes. He had an incredibly nice setup. And it's those years I want to talk about a little bit, because we actually don't have a lot of information in the Bible about what happened to Moses from about age 2 or 3 to age 40. There's a big gap. I mean, we know about his birth. We know that when he was weaned, which would have been around 2 or 3 years old, he was then sent back to Pharaoh's daughter. But what happened to him from then until we run into him again at age 40? And we don't know, but we can extrapolate some things, and that's some of the stuff I want to talk about today. Is I want to do a little extrapolating. I want to talk about his education. Education in Egypt was the best at that time, considered the best in the world. If you had a young child and you wanted to get them the finest education money could buy, you would have sent them to Egypt to get that education, provided, of course, you were nobility. It was the nobility that had the really good education. One of the reasons that they had such an incredible education is because Pharaoh actually handpicked every single teacher for the nobility. Every one of them. And he picked not just the best, say, silversmith, but a silversmith that was also an excellent teacher. I mean, we all know people in the trades, they're excellent at their trade, but that doesn't mean they can teach. You know, teaching's a different calling. But he looked for people that could do both. He looked for people that were fantastic at what they did, but then also had the ability to teach that to someone else. So all the noble children would have gone through and had tutors and teachers that were of the highest caliber. Another thing that was very different about the education in Egypt was that they actually also taught their daughters. And the reason that's kind of relevant is because we don't know that Moses actually got an education, but Moses' influence was Pharaoh's daughter, and she would have had a very good education. Most likely he did. And we're told later in Scripture they assume that he did receive the finest of educations. But at the very least, he would have been around Pharaoh's daughter, who would have had an excellent education, and that would have rubbed off on him. The way she spoke, the way she talked, the things she did, it would have rubbed off on him. And the entire household, for that matter. The household would have had a very fine education, which is where he would have been influenced. But let's talk a little more in depth about that education and what all it involved. Of course, reading and writing. And if y'all don't know, Egyptian is not just hieroglyphics. They actually had more than one script. They had a script that they usually wrote in and then the hieroglyphics. And so he would have had to learn both, to read in it and write in it as well. But that was the primary concern, was reading and writing. And again, Pharaoh would have gone out and he would have found someone that was excellent at writing, but then also an excellent teacher. And that would have been who taught Moses. Secondary to reading and writing was math. And part of the reason that math was important is that the Egyptians were a trade society. They were the nexus, really, of a lot of trade routes. Of course, they were in a very fertile area, so there was a lot of trade coming and going through Egypt. And of course, if you're making some trades and you're counting money, you want to make sure you got all that you were owed. So math was important. Music, believe it or not, was important to the Egyptians, so he would have had a great education in music. And we all know music can lift the spirit. A big difference. Why we sing hymns in church, because it makes such a big difference in our spirit and our psyche. Then religion. And Moses would have been taught by actual priests, not just someone that was trained in theology, but a priest that was also trained in theology, which you would hope most were, but it doesn't always go hand in hand, but it could be. Public speaking. Public speaking was incredibly important to the Egyptians. And I find this kind of ironic because Moses is the one that doesn't want to do what? He doesn't want to speak. And it's an assumption that he stuttered or something like that, but maybe he just hated this part of school. He just didn't want to stand up. But they would have actually had to practice this hours at a time. And they would have had to actually, stand up and give an oral report. So he would have been trained in it even if he didn't want to do it later. So the training was there. But there's some other things that were really, really important to the Egyptians. One of those is the fact that Egypt, being so fertile, was also a land that a lot of people wanted to conquer. And Egypt was, of course, always looking to expand as well. And so he would have been highly trained in military tactics. He would have known all of the latest strategies. He would have been trained in leadership to lead a military. I mean, he would have known an incredible lot. Whatever was known at that time about military strategy, Moses would have known it. He would have also been trained in physical combat. He would have known how to, probably a spear, a sword, whatever, arrows. He would have been taught how to do that, maybe even drive a chariot, whatever it was that they were, certainly horseback riding. He would have been taught all those skills. And at the best. I mean, he would have been taught by some of the best teachers. Geography. Geography was really important to the Egyptians because they were doing so much trading. And so they would have been very aware of where all the rivers were and where all the fertile croplands were, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, he would have had a map in his head before his lessons were over of where everything was. As part of his lessons, too, he would have actually gotten on the Nile and gone up and down the Nile a little bit to see some of this land. He would have gone on trips to see it. And that brings us to politics. In trade, you have to make sure that you say all the right things, do all the right things. So Moses would have learned that not everybody acted like an Egyptian. He would have recognized that there are some cultures that are different, that have different ways of greeting one another, and that some greetings can offend. For example, John David's always told us the story about, this means okay. Well, you don't do that. And was it Trinidad? Brazil. You don't do that in Brazil. It's the same as shooting somebody the finger. So you don't go to Brazil and say, sure, that's okay. So Moses would have been very aware of these things. He would have been all of the major trade partners that came in and out of Egypt, Moses would have been taught how to interact with them. Where handshake was appropriate, where it wasn't. What kind of greetings, etc. He would have also been taught multiple languages. Not only Egyptian, and of course he probably was learning some Hebrew, but he would have learned the language of Canaan and Mesopotamia, where the Fertile Crescent was, which is where Egypt did most of their trading. So he would have learned a lot and would have been very fluent in those. He also would have learned medicine. Egypt was the center of what was known about medicine at that time, so he would have been taught that because it was expected that if you were going out on military campaigns, you might need to know how to treat wounds. And then law. The Egyptians had been around for thousands and thousands of years, and through trial and error they had learned some things work and some things don't, and that you need some law to be civilized. So they had developed a pretty strong sense of the need of law and some fairly strong laws. So this is the education that Moses would have gotten as a child, up through, of course, where we finally pick him back up in the text. And that's what I want to do now, is pick him back up in the text. And that's Exodus 2, verses 11 through 15. One day after Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and saw their forced labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsfolk. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, he saw two Hebrews fighting, and he said to the one who was in the wrong, "Why do you strike your fellow Hebrew?" He answered, "Who made you a ruler and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "Surely the thing is known." When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh. Now, this is often considered a point where Moses deviates from God's plan. This is how scholars look at this, is that we all know, in hindsight, of course, the story of Moses and what Moses is going to do, right? He is going to lead the people out of out of Egypt. He's going to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. But how can he? Because now he's got to flee. And we, of course, know what's going to happen. But he is there. He sees this injustice going on, and he kills one Egyptian guard to save one Hebrew person. That does not match what God had in plan for him. He kind of took the plan into his own hands, and because he took it in on his own hands, how much effect has he had? Not much. He saved one Hebrew, and now he's running. And he's got to leave Egypt. So God had a plan for him to liberate the people, but Moses isn't even there anymore. That's how a lot of scholars look at this, is that Moses kind of ruined the plan. Now, we all know that God was still at work, and God came back and got it all sorted out the way it was meant to be. But Moses deviated from the script. He decided he would do it his way, and because he did it his way, it wasn't very effective. But here is the awesome thing about serving God, is that, of course, God put into action his own plan, despite what Moses did, and still got where God wanted everything to end up. So now we can say, well, Moses took this wrong turn, this crooked path. And so he wasted this time. But did he? Doesn't God use our wasted time for great things? Let's think about Moses' education for a minute. All this stuff he learned while he was an Egyptian, now suddenly when he gets ready to bring the people out, because he will eventually get back to Egypt, and he is going to lead the people out, guess what he has the skills to do? Be a leader. He's been trained in leadership. He's been trained in etiquette, the proper way to approach nobility. Because, you know, there is a new Pharaoh in charge that maybe doesn't know his history, but what's to keep the new Pharaoh from saying, I don't even want to hear you? But Moses comes as an ambassador or comes as an emissary and knows exactly what to say to get in attendance to Pharaoh so that he can say his thing. And then after he says his thing and things aren't working, Moses knows how to keep the people together who are wanting to revolt against Moses now. Moses has the skills to keep them all organized. Now, Moses, when Pharaoh finally says, okay, take them and go, it's a big piece of real estate once they leave Egypt that they have never walked through. But it doesn't matter. Moses has a map in his head. He knows where the water is. He knows what lands they're going to cross through. He knows where the trade route is. One of the things, too, about the trade route, despite the fact that it was kind of a universally used trade route, it still passed through all these other nations. And every single nation they traveled through wanted a toll. And guess who could speak all of the languages? Guess who knew the proper way to greet every one of the leaders when they got to the new place in their language, in their customs? Don't you know people were getting sick and injured along the road? Guess who knew how to train up a whole bunch of physicians? And then, of course, as they're moving along and they're realizing that they're going to have to fight, guess who knows how to train them in hand-to-hand combat and in military strategy should they need it? Moses. And then as they start thinking about organizing as a nation, one of the things that you need is some kind of order. And guess who's been trained in law? Moses. all that stuff that happened to Moses and all the twists and turns that happened in Moses' life, it was okay because God looked and used it. God was able to take Moses' life, and despite all the things that happened and almost didn't happen, I mean, he should have never lived past infancy. He should have never lived past being put in the river and pushed down river. Pharaoh's daughter could have easily said, no, I'm not going to keep him. But yet, despite all those twists and turns and all the things that happened to him, and I'm sure at some point when he accepted that calling, he probably thought back and said, but God, I've wasted so much of my life. And God said, watch this. Watch what I can do. All those things that you learned, I can use them. And the same is true for every single one of us. Some of us have taken some very crooked roads. We have gone down some paths that in hindsight we really regret. And now we've got scars and we've got wounds and we've got all this stuff in our life from taking those wrong roads. And the thing is that if we surrender all of that to God, God will say, watch what I can do with that. First of all, God can heal it. He can buff out all those scratches, heal all those wounds. But the things we learn from that stuff, God can make us different people. He can make us understand things that we wouldn't have understood if we hadn't gone down those crooked roads. I mean, I know in my own childhood, suffering for some of the abuse that I went through, I really think I'm a more compassionate, empathetic person because of it. I'm not sure I would care as much if I hadn't been there, you know? I mean, I think all of us take crooked roads and we don't realize that God can take everything from that crooked road and help our relationship with God and help others. He can use all of that. You know, if you've struggled with addiction and you're successful now, you're doing well, guess who, though, you can help and guide? Someone that's also struggling with addiction. Because you know what it's like. You know it's not just a simple thing where you just say, don't do it anymore. You know it's not that simple. So God can take even the times when we feel like we're doing nothing, when we feel like we've just kind of stalled out in life and we're not even moving. We're not even taking a good road or a bad road. We're just not moving. And we may at one point say, man, God, I've been wasting my life. You know what God can do? Anything. You know how old Moses was when he headed back to Egypt? 80. He was 80 years old when he headed back to Egypt and then led the people out. So I am so thankful for a God that looks at our lives, no matter the crooked roads we've taken, and says, I can use that. So I ask all of us today, take it all to God and say, God, use what you want and lose the rest of it. Amen? All right. I want to finish with a song that I think says what I was trying to say much better in words, but I want to warn you, it was a country western love song originally, and it was re-recorded by a contemporary Christian group. So you're going to listen to it and say, well, I don't know, Tinker, that's kind of borderline whether that's a Christian song or not, but it's about God and Jesus, but just remember it was originally a love song. So I hope you enjoy it, and I hope it ministers to you in the same way.